I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Ia Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey guys. Today we are continuing our series on postmodern novels of the South with a discussion of John Kennedy Toole's A Confederacy of Dunces. As a reminder, you can join our extended book club discussion on Reddit at CanonicalPod. You can also find us on social media at CanonicalPod, all one word. If you would like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which you can find in our episode description. We will be talking spoilers here, so if you don't want the ending spoiled for you, check out our review episode, which was published last week. Next week, we will review our second book in the series, Swamplandia, by Karen Russel. So stay tuned.
Well, we're still on the topic of A Confederacy of Dunces. The thing that I think is interesting to look at here is the publication history of this novel. Looking back from now, when we think about a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel that was initially rejected for publication, it's easy to think that the editor was kind of a fool for passing up the novel. But we actually are able to see the editor's notes and correspondence with the novelist, John Kennedy Toole, and we can see what he had to say about the novel and why he rejected it. And I think that analyzing those comments will add some insight to this novel and add some insight to our understanding of the novel. So the editor's name is Robert Gottlieb at Simon & Schuster, and he corresponded with Toole for several years when Toole was trying to get the novel published. And the most important critique that he mentions in his letters is that the novel does not seem to have any purpose. He admitted Toole had created brilliant scenes and wittily tied them together at the end, but the threads must be strong and meaningful all the way through. His comments echoed another critic's advice when she told Toole in 1961, saying, "You have to be saying something that you really mean, not just dredging characters and situations up because they're charming." So let's focus on that first. Do you think that these criticisms are valid? Do you think there's any purpose to Toole's organization of the novel, or is it just a bunch of scenes kind of tied together?
I think there is a through line. I think, as we were talking last episode, there is a very well done method of tying up loose ends and bringing characters back from the beginning into the end. So the sequence of things makes sense to me. But I do see the criticisms of this being a fairly light novel. I already knew that this was a Pulitzer-winning book, but after reading it, I was scratching my head a little bit.
Right. So there are no MacGuffins. This is Sam's favorite literary term. There are no MacGuffins in this novel. Everything that we find in the beginning of this novel has a purpose later in the novel. But it seems to me like all of the things that come to have a purpose later in the novel were introduced in the first place only so that they could work later on in the novel. So, for example, Mr. Robichaux in the first scene in the novel later becomes Riley's mother's suitor. And Jones as well, who Mr. Robichaux meets in the jail, also becomes the janitor at the Night of Joy. So it seems like these characters exist in kind of a circular vacuum. They exist and they're all contained within the vacuum, but there's no real meaning or message behind their placement inside. Let's talk here about Burma Jones. Does Jones have anything to say for himself in the novel? Does he exist for a Toole to say anything about the plight of African Americans, or is he just kind of a stock character?
I think he exists partly as sort of a voice of reason, even though he's not an expected voice of reason the way he's portrayed. He's one of the few characters that can see through the BS that is constantly surrounding Ignatius. He's the only character that plays Ignatius. Everyone else plays to him. Jones is able to manipulate the people around him, especially Ignatius, to his own purpose. And his plans are kind of the only ones that pan out. Everyone else's falls apart or don't go as planned.
I agree with everything that you're saying, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is it seems like there should be more justifying his presence in the novel rather than just describing kind of what he does in the novel. What I'm trying to figure out is, why is he there? Why are any of these characters there? What is Toole trying to get at?
So, as you guys know, I kind of look at novels in different ways and how they succeed in different ways. For me, this novel is very successful on a craft level. And what the editor is saying is, obviously, you've got the plot down, but you don't have any of the ideas present. And the editor was looking for that. So to the question of whether or not that's valid, I think it is a valid criticism in that any criticism about a work is valid. I wonder, though, if the editor was trying to force some of his own views of what fiction should be onto what this book is. And obviously, once it got published, it was received very well. So to that end, I don't think that criticism was particularly effective, because the vision that Toole had for the book was successful if you judge success by how it's received, by the wider public, by critics after its publication. So the problem I see with what this editor said is, to me, he is trying to force what he thinks literature should be onto this book. But when it was published, it's obvious to me that other people thought, no, you don't need to have that at all. What you have here is already a work of literature. It is already significant. So to your question, Iad, I think it is still trying to answer what that editor is posing. You're saying, well, what makes this significant? I think there is significance here in that he's writing a story or a novel about people in a certain place. I think that has some importance, but it doesn't have a lot of importance. It's not a very socially important novel. So I don't think it has anything particularly important to say about race, for example, or about the gay experience, or maybe even about the white experience in Louisiana. I think what it does say or exhibit is a masterful work created by someone who's very good at plotting and characterization and pacing, and someone who tells a very good story in a very, very particular place, a place that isn't always represented in fiction.
Is that enough, though? I mean, people enjoy the novel, but their enjoyment of the novel doesn't really mean much to me, because people enjoy a lot of things. But would the novel be better if these things that we find so enjoyable in the novel also existed to serve some sort of structure of ideas or some sort of larger theme that the novelist was pointing to? And my answer would always be yes. If we could add some larger thematic content to the novel, it would be even better. So their absence is still pretty significant to me.
This harkens back to a lot of our conversations from before about social concerns versus aesthetics versus craft. I think that each individual work does not necessarily need to have some big idea or theme. I think it can be very successful without it. For example, an experimental work that is focused purely on form, I think that is a work of art, even if it does not address anything that we would consider important, even if it does not, like Stoner does, take on a big idea of how to live a good life. That, for me, is still a worthwhile book and something that is art or literature. So I don't think that it needs to have it, and I don't think that it necessarily makes it better. I think it just makes it different.
Does that change when we're talking about a Pulitzer Prize winner?
Maybe, but I think you can award prizes for all kinds of reasons. If you have something that is legitimately interesting and new in art. So for me, the easiest artist to reference is someone like Jackson Pollock, but even someone who's like a hyper-realist painter or a pointillist, like someone who does things very differently. If that person gets acclaim because what he does is different, I think that's worthwhile. It shouldn't be diminished because the subject matter that he is portraying is not as important.
I do want to make clear that I did enjoy reading this, but it does make me wonder what else was going on in the literary world in 1980, 1981 that prompted this to win the Pulitzer Prize. I would not have expected this to win the Pulitzer. But maybe like you say, maybe it was just so different from everything else that was happening.
The closest thing I could point to as being larger thematic content in the novel is Ignatius's worldview, specifically his fascination with constellations of philosophy. He is an anachronism by his own proclamation, and that to me seems quite significant because he's distinct not only from the other mature characters in the novel, but other social activists like Myrna Minkoff. He's distinct from her and her type as well. So what is the significance of his particular worldview? Why is that constantly being referred to?
He's talking about a morality that no one's talking about anymore because it's very old and out of fashion. One of the things I was struggling with, and this just, I chalked it up to it being humor, is does he actually believe these things? How much of Ignatius are we supposed to take seriously?
I don't think he knows he's a hypocrite, but I think in his heart, he does sincerely believe the things that he says. For me, just to kind of finish off with this point, though, I think that, well, I agree with James that a work can be rewarding and valuable if it's just formally experimental or it does another thing very well. What I feel difficulty with is that the novel picks up not a general type of anachronism, but it points to a very specific medieval worldview, a very specific philosopher, a very specific book, and then it uses that constantly throughout the novel, but it doesn't establish any sort of coherent worldview that we can point to. And while it's true that he can be a hypocrite, what he believes should be articulated in at least some manner, and I don't think it's really articulated very well, which gives me the impression that it's just a bit too shallow. It's just using this kind of system of belief just for the texture or the appearance of a belief without really engaging it in any meaningful way.
I agree with you, Ian. I do think that his use of Boethius and the constellation of philosophy is not extremely well rendered throughout. I think it's missing that kind of unified theory almost, where you expect a writer, much like, let's just to take your favorite book, Stoner, someone who executes on the level of ideas throughout the book. I don't think he does it here. But I do think that the constellation of philosophy is applicable in kind of a referential way. It is intertextual. It asks you to kind of understand the constellation of philosophy and look at how it is also referenced indirectly in the construction of the book. So, for example, Boethius is a Roman official who was imprisoned by an Ostrogothic king. So he's a Roman who's unfairly judged and imprisoned by a barbarian. And I think that kind of reflects his own standing or how he views himself in the world, that he is a learned man surrounded by idiots, by barbarians, by dunces. I think that has some kind of rhyming pattern, but it's not really explored fully. The book is a conversation between the author Boethius and Lady Philosophy, and throughout the book he writes to Myrna Minkoff, and it's almost a satire of Lady Philosophy because Myrna Minkoff is kind of a corrupted version of Lady Philosophy, right? She is very crude. She's very interested in sex. She's kind of the opposite of what you would expect from Lady Philosophy. And also, the book is about how a person is constantly at the whim of fortune, and throughout the novel, A Confederacy of Dunces, Ignatius refers to Fortuna and how fate spins the wheel, and he's sort of at the whim or at the mercy of fate. So it does kind of refer to it, and it does get borne out in the book. And also a critic has mentioned, I didn't read of Consolation Philosophy, so I don't know if this is accurate, but I assume it is, that the book is similar to the Consolation of Philosophy in its format. So in that way, it is tied to it. He's not just referencing it for no reason. The problem is that there is no coherent moral argument in play unless you're saying the moral argument is we are all just governed by fate. And that's something he talks about, but I am not sure if you can make that argument in this novel. I think you could try, but I don't know if it's convincing.
I think the engagement that we do see, I think that your points are valid, but I think that the level of engagement with ideas is such that if we look at a contemporary novel to A Confederacy of Dunces, if we look at Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49, and we look at the way that that novel engages with, I believe it was contemporary communications technology, like the forerunners of the internet and things like that, it's clear that Pynchon is able to have a comic novel and also a satirical novel, but engage with contemporary intertextual science and philosophy and everything else in a way that just seems to exceed Toole. And obviously setting that as kind of the high watermark is perhaps unfair to Toole, but that's kind of what I expect, if you want to introduce these things and to really make the most of them, you've set a very high standard for yourself, and you've set a very onerous task for yourself. And I just don't think that it was developed as much as it could have been.
Yeah, I think I agree with you here, and I think, Sam, you also agree, if I may speak for you. On the idea level, I think it is not executed as well as it could be. I think what it does is it motions to ideas, and it invites you to perhaps do your own research. And if you do, you'll be rewarded with almost like Easter eggs. But it's not enough to contribute to some coherent statement about morality or about the state of our world today or at that time.
As a final note here, I also took a look at the editor Robert Gottlieb's memoir, Avid Reader, and 50 years after he rejected the novel, he went back to it and he looked at it, and he said that he hadn't changed his opinion at all.
Something I found interesting about that is I found multiple cases of all sorts of different opinions. His didn't change at all. I saw some other reviewer had read it when it came out and absolutely loved it, and then read it within the past few years and did not connect with it at all anymore. And then people that continue to reread it and still love it. So I feel like this is a very divisive book. People that love it really love it, and people that don't really don't.
The true strength of this novel, the only thing when I read it, I thought, okay, this is maybe one reason why it would win the Pulitzer, is I think the plot is really well executed. It is possibly one of the best plotted novels I've seen in terms of how he does pacing, how the different plot lines weave in and out. And he pulls off something that is very difficult. He surprises, all the time. I find myself surprised in how he introduces a character later on. He returns to a character, or he calls back to a character that you think is a side character, and then you find out it's not a side character. Actually, this person will have his own arc, like Mr. Levy, for example. I guess it's one of those elements of fiction that gets maligned because plot is something that people just kind of think is not as important as characterization or imagery even, or themes or ideas. So there's a reason why I think this book gets a little overlooked when it comes to assessing its literary qualities, because people look at plot as something that's in the purview of genre, that it's only important for mystery novels, for example. So for me, this is one reason why, once again, that it's been so well appreciated. He does this aspect of it extremely well, whereas he does not execute on the idea of the novel very well at all.
The idea behind the novel, the meaning, is something that I want to dive into more. This is a comedic, picaresque novel of the South. It's hard to ignore how often reviews and critiques of this novel invoke Mark Twain, especially Huckleberry Finn. Twain used his characters in that book to explore slavery and the treatment of black people in the U.S., and especially the South. But many of those same critics have said that Confederacy of Dunces isn't really about anything and is light on meaning. In his essay, A Confederacy of Dunces as Reverse Satire, the American Subgenre, David McNeill writes that this form of satire is a double-edged sword, in which the satirist persona or satirist character makes his attack and is ironically ridiculed himself. Ignatius rails against immorality and modernity, consumerism, capitalism, and a lot more. Yet at each turn, he shows himself to be a perversion of the ideals he supposedly professes. It's a wide net that Toole casts here. So what would you say is the point, if there is one, and what is really being ridiculed?
I think that the novel ridicules Ignatius much more than it ridicules the world around him. I think that his inability to see how hypocritical he is just the kind of icing on the cake in terms of how ridiculous he is as a character.
Is that part of then why this is kind of lighter? Because it's not ridiculing ideas as much or the society around him as much as it's ridiculing this one fictitious character?
I would say so. Again, this points back to what I was saying earlier. His worldview isn't really explicated very clearly. So when we laugh at Riley, we're just laughing at Riley. I don't really know what else we're laughing at. And because we're only laughing at Riley, the significance doesn't really have a chance to kind of echo and reverberate throughout. I mean, very broadly, Miss Levy and Ignatius are kind of examples of a certain shallowness of learning. So you could say that the novel is pointing to that, but that doesn't seem particularly insightful because it's clear from the beginning that a shallowness of learning is a negative quality. It doesn't take much to show the reader that that's true, and it's something that the reader probably would already have assumed was true.
Maybe there's something more about the opposite, though, that we have this character that is well-read, supposedly, and he knows he's intelligent, but he can't interact with anyone around him. He can't apply his ideas well or accurately. And he has these misplaced ideals that don't help him or anyone around him. So maybe there's something more to that. Maybe he's the opposite.
What's interesting is when you first encounter Ignatius, you might think that he is someone who's quite moral. Because he talks about it so damn much all the time. He's always accusing other people of whatever moral transgression that they happen to be committing at that time. And most people in the book are violating some kind of norms in society. But, according to the consolation of philosophy, people should be eschewing money and power, and instead they should be pursuing a life of virtue, of internal virtue. And obviously, Ignatius is not doing that. So it's this kind of hypocrisy that's present throughout. And it seems to me that the book is very much about that hypocrisy. It's about a character who prescribes a moral life for others, but he himself obviously is not living that moral life. Because of that, he is constantly being skewered for it. We see it through dramatic irony, but through plot developments, you also see that by acting in a less than virtuous way, because he's trying to do things for his own edification, like leading that group of workers on a strike. He's not doing it for them. It's not because of virtue. He's doing it because he wants to be in charge and show up Myrna Minkov. We see that he's kind of taken down a peg. We see that he is a hypocrite. And for me, that is what the book, or what Ignatius represents in the novel, this kind of shallow understanding of a moral life.
So is this advocating for a better understanding of what morality means?
That's the issue, I think, is because I don't think this book advocates for anything. I think it satirizes everything, but I don't think the book is ever making a positive statement, which is why, to circle back to what we were talking about earlier, why maybe, Ed, that you find it hard to grapple with something here, because I don't think there is any positive statement being made. And you might also argue that this kind of negative statement is very easy. It's very easy to skewer. It's much more difficult to build.
I think you're right. It doesn't really have any insight when it comes to an alternative to the kind of shallow moral or shallow intellectual behavior that we find in Riley and all of the other characters in the novel. And that's kind of what I was pointing to in our review episode last week as well, is that there is no center of sympathy within the novel. There is no person or authorial persona that we can point to and say, well, this is who I side with, because I don't side with Riley. I don't side with Minkoff. I don't side with Toole. I just find that the novel, on the level of ideas, is an exercise in pointing to obviously bad things and saying these are bad things. And to me, that's not very stimulating, because it's quite clear from the outset that these are bad things.
I think the only idea that might rise to that level of examination could be how norms, societal norms, are treated in the novel, because you have a novel created almost entirely of outsiders, with the exception, I'd say, of the Levies. I think everyone else is an outsider of some sort. Also, most of the characters violate some kind of societal norm. And the book plays with that idea. It looks at how maybe it's almost a celebration of that violation, because characters are not punished for acting in a deviant way.
It's kind of interesting to me that Ignatius, I did see someone writing for The Guardian who claims that Ignatius does grow. And I think there's some evidence of that, but not a whole lot. And I think there's more evidence to the contrary. But it's interesting to me that Ignatius forces change on everyone around him. We talked about character arcs and how pretty much all of the other characters have arcs. They change, they grow, or they fall. Except for Ignatius. He's just this whirlwind of change, I guess, that he forces on others, but not on himself.
To that, I would say that he does change, but he changes in a superficial way. He refuses to let circumstances change him. So when he initially starts working in the novel, after rejecting work, he decides to start working only because he thinks that the experience of work will somehow benefit his writing. And then later on in the novel, when he's worried about being taken away to the psychiatric hospital and Myrna Minkoff shows up, he seems to have changed his attitude towards her, but it's not clear if he actually feels differently or if he's just seizing the opportunity to escape danger.
I got the impression that it was the latter, that when she brings that up, he does act deferential briefly, but it seemed to me like just a way of placating her in order to get away.
I do too. I feel the same way.
It seems like it's possibly the case that he's just seizing the opportunity, but he also seems like a character who would have difficulty expressing sincere emotions rather than just condemnation all the time. So if he generally had a change of heart about Myrna, he probably wouldn't know how to express it fluently from the beginning.
It's true. And I did bring this up in the last episode that end, just a few pages before the end, is where the real stakes come in. And I think he recognizes that. It's the first time that he sees his actions have real consequences. But his reaction to those do seem superficial still.
I wonder what you guys thought about that section with the dog, where Mr. Levy was talking to the neighbor, because I found it actually really moving. I think that you have Ignatius, and it's difficult because throughout the book, as I mentioned in the last episode, your view of who he is always being played with and subverted. But I could see an Ignatius who was quite earnest in his younger days, but and someone who is a believer in the church or whatever, but he has a dog that dies and the church refuses to bury the dog or to have a mass for the dog, right?
Yeah.
Like, I could see that being a moment in his life that causes him to become jaded or bitter.
Right. Well, that's what the neighbor says.
It does seem like he's been emotionally stunted by that.
Yeah. I mean, it's more than being emotionally stunted. I think it's something that actually makes him into a much more bitter person. Someone who maybe does not follow the teachings of the church because the church refuses to care for something that he loves. But at the same time, because our view of Ignatius is constantly changing throughout the book, you might look at this and say, well, it's probably wrong, or it could be wrong. It's just a neighbor's opinion of him.
I think it is true, but I think if we had the ability to see more clearly what happened in his past, we would see that he's clearly a ruined man at this point in his life. He's clearly a dysfunctional man. And if we were able to see the transformation from a well-adjusted young boy into a bitter, probably crazy adult man, he would become a tragic figure, and that would ruin all of the comedy in the novel. He would become more pathetic than he could be if we want to laugh at him.
I think that's what Gottlieb wanted.
Yeah.
From reading his notes and reading that part of the book, he wanted a more traditional kind of novel, because this idea is very traditional.
Well, here's the thing, though. It's a bigger question than I can answer. Is there a conflict between tragedy and comedy in this novel? Because I feel if we get the tragedy of Ignatius becoming crazy, of him becoming insane in his particular way, is he still funny?
I don't know, but there were suppositions that I read that Toole may have had undiagnosed schizophrenia. And that kind of started to change my view of Ignatius a little bit. Because a lot of this character does seem like it bled from Toole's life.
I think it's a different kind of comedy yet. If you have that kind of tragic character, you can have still, in my opinion, a comic novel, but that kind of comedy is different from this kind of comedy. This is very farcical. I think that kind of comedy would not be farcical. It would be much sadder.
I mean, you've kind of pointed exactly to the issue that I was having before, is that it's farcical humor. And I think that there are lots of things that a novel can bring to the table besides grand ideas and big themes that would justify the novel. But I think that farcical humor is kind of antithetical to a work of art. It's the lowest rung, you know? It's like something that most writers with sufficient talent could come up with pretty easily. And that's the thing that even though I enjoy the humor, it prevents it from attaining the greater heights. That to me is the problem that I have with the novel.
let's take a break now, and when we come back, we'll talk about this novel's rise to fame. Welcome back. Last week, we talked a little bit about this novel's publication history. How do you think the publication history of this novel and Toole's suicide affected its reception? Do you think because we know about the history of this book and the circuitous route it took to publication that we are biased?
I think it definitely colored people's opinions. I think it certainly helped it win the Pulitzer. But I do think there are good things here. I do think not just the humor, although I think that's the biggest thing it has going for it. But I think it was certainly helped by the unique problems that the author faced and his eventual suicide.
It's the kind of story that readers latch onto. It's easy to understand. It's basically, the stereotypical story of a struggling writer, can't get his work published, gets depressed, starts drinking, commits suicide, lost classic rediscovered 20 years later. It has all of the big kind of pieces that you would expect from this kind of a story, and I think that readers enjoy that.
It's the same with Stoner, right?
Yeah.
I think so much of whether or not a book is successful commercially is the narrative around the book. And when you have an easily accessible narrative that's also compelling, like a forgotten novel or a genius who died before his time, something like that makes it very marketable.
If Toole had not committed suicide, do you think he would have written different types of novels, or do you think we would see similar novels?
I don't know if we can answer that. Because I'm thinking about Pynchon and how I've only read Crying of Lot 49, but I've heard that Mason and Dixon is quite different from The Crying of Lot 49, for example.
The only reason why I ask the question is because the novel is a very specific type of novel, and it does certain things very well, but it avoids other things. And my feeling is that it avoids those things because Toole didn't think he could do them. And obviously there's no way to know, but it does suggest that perhaps this is his wheelhouse. This is the thing that he can do. And, perhaps he could reinvent himself, but perhaps not.
This is similar to other books we have read in that it's a first novel, and you see a lot of the trademark qualities of a first novel. It's pretty autobiographical. It's set in a very comfortable setting that he knows intimately.
I think, wasn't this his second book?
The first novel is The Neon Bible, which he published when he was 16, but he very quickly disowned it.
Right.
As kind of a curiosity, Williams, the author of Stoner, also has a novel that he wrote that he disowned. He wrote it when he was young and in the army.
There are a lot of qualities of this kind of first novel here. And some writers never get over that kind of story. John Irving writes a lot of similar themes over and over again. Murakami always, visits the same well, pun intended.
Yeah.
So some writers don't, but other writers do. So that's why I think it's almost impossible to tell, because as a first novel, it's kind of about what you expect. It's about this character who's quite autobiographical.
Here's something that I've been mulling over, and I don't know that this is a perfectly apt comparison, but when I think about Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin movies, there is usually more an aesthetic than a social concern there. But they're classic, and there's reasons for them being classic, not just because they're early movies, but the aesthetics, they're slapstick at their core. And we've been denigrating this book a little bit because it's farcical and slapstick. But that is chiefly what a lot of those movies are. And what makes them stand out is that not just that they're early movies, those would be quickly forgotten if that was all they had going for them. But they also, especially Buster Keaton, show a lot of this understanding of the medium and incredible talent for stunts and manipulating audience expectation, even though usually there isn't a whole lot deeper than a love story. And I think that's something important to note, that we don't have a love story here. There's something a little bit deeper in some ways than that, but not much. And we have talked about that it's pretty masterful in the plotting and the constant humor.
The constant humor for me is the novelty. I think if this kind of novel was the norm, then this book would obviously not be impressive. Part of what I'm impressed by is the fact that I have not read, I don't think, any book that's like this. You know, a lot of the books that I read are the kinds of novels that you're talking about, yet, where the writer is trying to engage with some bigger meaning, some idea, sort of that kind of modernist novel. And it's the kind of novel you read in school often. I don't think I've read a book like this that, kind of argues against that in a way.
It's a different style of writing, but I kept thinking about Hunter S. Thompson and his gonzo journalism. But it's a very different style from what we have here. But it is almost constant in its joking and biting commentary.
Well, let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. You can find our reading schedule on Reddit at CanonicalPod, one word, where we post threads for our book club discussion every Wednesday. We'd love for you to join us there. Also, you can find us on social media at CanonicalPod, and if you would like to support us and your local independent bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. Next week, we will review our second book in the series, Swamplandia, by Karen Russel. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.